Well, good morning, and on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, welcome. And thank you for joining us today for what will be a very interesting conversation with Margaret Coker um, about her book, The Spymaster of Baghdad, a true story of bravery, family, and patriotism in the battle against ISIS. Um, I want to flag for our audience today the fact that our very own Joshua Huminski has written, I think, quite a nice review of the book, and it's worth a read. The book looks like a really tremendous piece of work by our guest today. And I'm going to drop in the chat box for everyone a copy of the review. And so I hope that folks will take advantage of that and also get the book. But we have a preview ahead of us today from the author herself, and we're very pleased to have her because the topic of intelligence, operation, collection, counter ISIS, and just Iraq writ large is one of those that some people think has moved off the headline in terms of what's driving the conversation in Washington when it comes to foreign policy and national security affairs with China and Russia and other topics dominating, and the attempt of the American administration once again to try to pivot focus to Asia and China. But it is, I think, vitally important that we understand both the challenges that the United States faced in trying to take on operations in Iraq, and also some of those personal stories. I was posted with USAID in Baghdad through most of 2007. I went out with the surge, although I was a civilian. So I was on the civilian side of it, but we were working counterinsurgency. And I think my experience over the course of that year in Iraq taught me more than I ever thought I could learn about the American policy process, about military and intelligence, the importance of those operations working well, the challenges of nation building, of counterinsurgency, the way the US government makes decisions and how those decisions are made and carried out in the field, and how that reflects back on the national security of the United States. And I think it is vital that we as a country learn these lessons and incorporate them well. The work that authors like Margaret Coker have done to help us understand from a micro view, from the point of view of the players on the field and from the Iraqi perspective, I think is a vitally important part of that understanding. And so we really appreciate her taking on the work to put this book together based on largely on her experience being the Baghdad bureau chief for the New York Times. And it is a wonderfully informative take on the challenges of counter ISIS intelligence from the point of view of some of the Iraqi players. But I'll let her describe her process in the book itself. I just want to say how pleased we are to be hosting her today. A really important conversation. Thank you again for spending the time in the field, for your overall work trying to help Americans understand the challenges in Iraq, and for compiling many of those experiences and lessons in this book for us. Margaret, I'll turn the floor over to you, and why don't you tell us a little bit about how you decided to write this particular book, the process for putting together the stories, and then what do we as Americans need to take away from the lessons of Abu Ali al-Basri and the people that were, working on the counter ISIS intelligence effort around him.
Hi, am I unmuted?
You're good now.
Perfect.
We hear you. Yep, go ahead.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. I imagine that the people listening in are probably more academically professional in terms of Middle East policy than I am. I'm actually something of a accidental Mideast and war correspondent. I grew up in a military family here in the U.S. That's the family profession. I grew up moving around a lot, and I got used to explaining to friends and family, stories about places where I'd been and lived that they had never been to, which was the whole kernel of why I became a journalist. But I was a Cold War baby. I graduated when the Soviet Union was breaking apart. I spoke Russian as my one and only marketable skill after a liberal arts education. And so right place, right time, I had the ability to do men and women on the street interviews, as we used to call them. And so I started off in the former Soviet Union as a foreign correspondent. Then after the 9/11 attacks, when all of our lives changed so dramatically, my newspaper took me to Afghanistan and then the Middle East. So I've been going in and out of Iraq since 2003. And like Representative Nye, sort of was there in the bloodiest of times when Baghdad was known as the murder capital of the world. And Iraqi families, and of course, US servicemen and women had no idea whether they were going to end the day alive or not. But when I went back for the New York Times then in 2017, we had all looked on in horror as the Islamic State had their blitzkrieg across northern Iraq. They had taken over a third of the nation. They were running a proto-state. They were the most, horrifying terrorist organization that we had seen in the 21st century. But in 2017, we had gone from a time when Baghdad, embassies in 2014 were saying we're instituting emergency evacuation orders. People thought Baghdad could be sacked like the Mongol hordes had in the Middle Ages. And then in 2017, it was a whole different place. It was a capital that was undergoing a renaissance. There were nightclubs. Families were out at night. Kids were playing soccer and playing in playgrounds, and people felt safe. And it was really what a remarkable turnaround for a capital. A very small journalistic question, which is, who was able to crack that nut? Who had made Baghdad safe? From the time where you had been there, Representative Nye, when multiple car bombings were going off every day, to a time when small businesses were flourishing. And so it was a very roundabout but very simple journalistic exercise to find out who had made Baghdad safe again. So there was a culmination of a lot of forces that got me to the answer and to the door of Abu Ali al-Basri, who is the Spymaster in my title. So in a roundabout way, this book was a process of combining all of my personal background and literary interests. I had been in the former Soviet Union where we were all very interested in the mid-90s about institutional reform and how you can transform a country that had been basically a one-party state, an authoritarian police state for so long, and build democracies from those institutions, warped as they were, to Iraq, where the same meta realities were in play, in addition then, of course, as we know, to Islamic terrorism. So finding Abu Ali al-Basri, who was a man who really kind of put on his gray suit every day and went to the corridors of power, survived 3 prime ministers, and built up this elite and very secretive intelligence unit, was it was journalistic gold, but it was also academically incredibly interesting, because as we all have this perception of Iraq as a place full of governmental chaos, there actually was a small agency that was working very well. And so I got Abu Ali's trust. He decided he was going to tell me this incredibly, thrilling tale of wartime espionage and break classification, because he had a very human motivation. His great success as a spy master was putting one of his own officers undercover inside the Islamic State for 17 months. And then he lost his officer behind enemy lines. And he simply, was distraught, as generals and officers, and I think bosses around the world know. When you lose someone that you've put in harm's way, it you feel it inside. So that's how he wanted to tell the story. He wanted to help the family of the undercover officer, and I was the journalistic vessel through which he started telling his tales. I published that story for the New York Times, and then decided to do a full book-length treatment of showing Americans who are, we're all very used to tales from Iraq over the last 17 years, told from the US point of view, from policy angles, from military angles, and we don't really know the names and the stories of our partners who have been with us, side by side, and taking up the vacuum after US forces withdrew in 2010 to keep us all abreast of and then safe from Islamic extremism. So Abu Ali al-Basri decided to work with me on a full-length book. The two of men from his band of brothers, known as the Falcons, or al-Suqur in Arabic, the family decided to work with me as well. And so I had access to a lot of great tales, right? I mean, the Falcons opened up their files to me. I saw lots of operational details, had access to interrogators who, again, can be good guys or bad guys, depending on where you sit on which side of the table. I had a lot of buy-in for the book from four former prime ministers of Iraq, who gave me lots of access and confirmation of national security policy decisions that had happened over the course of the last decade. I was also, I had access to national security documents that are in Baghdad and in Arabic that don't, again, the things that primary, as far as primary documents to a draft of history, also don't get a whole lot of attention, at least in the Anglo-English press. So having a lot of this academic knowledge, having a lot of documents to sift through, having access to primary sources to do the kind of journalism I like to do, which is human interest tales. I've combined this all into a story that I hope that Middle East specialists will enjoy and will actually learn something about Iraq. But I've also written it in a way that Americans who haven't paid attention to Iraq for years, maybe not at all, will also find themselves entertained and thrilled, and then learn something about Iraq despite themselves. So it was a pretty fascinating journalistic challenge to get this all done. With so much buy-in from all of the senior Iraqi officials, I actually finished my research in about a year, and then took another 6-7 months to do the writing, and went back and forth to Baghdad, at least 8, 9, 10 times, in part because there's a lot of documents to sift through. Important people have busy schedules, and you jump when they say, "I'm ready to see you," and so you get on another plane. At that point, I was based in Dubai. My husband, who's also a journalist, was the Wall Street Journal's Afghan bureau chief at the time. So our base camp was Dubai for a very long time. And so there was a lot of time spent in families' living rooms, talking to mothers, talking to wives, talking to the band of brothers, a lot of time trying to verify facts that you saw on paper that you wanted to make sure were accurate before I included in the book. And then there was a whole lot of time also taken to really make sure that I respected sources and methods and weren't going to endanger men who were still out in the field. And I say men, it's a gender sensitive time that we're living in the US, but in fact, the band of brothers, the Falcons, are a all male organization. But included in my book, I also have a villain. And there are successes, there are definitely foibles, there's insider tales about how Abu Ali al-Basri, the spy master, sort of navigated the corridors of power, bureaucratic power in Baghdad, which is no small thing if you are a career civil servant. I think that's not that's something that crosses many cultural borders. But in terms of the both the successes and the failures, I asked the Falcons to tell me about sort of their 5 best missions, and how they gained the trust of the Americans to become a partner in counterterrorism work, because Abu Ali al-Basri was not the first choice that the Americans had in terms of high-level intelligence partners, in terms of the way in which the US went about rebuilding security services and security forces in Iraq in the mid 2000s. The US also definitely made some mistakes. There was the first man who anointed as the head of the new National Intelligence Agency turned out to be much less effective than we needed him to be. And Abu Ali al-Basri sort of moved through those disappointments and that disillusionment up into the limelight, as it were. So one of the most incredible and scoopy journalistic success stories that I have in the book was that we all have probably read stories about the Islamic State's chemical weapons research department and their desire to both build and then use weapons of mass destruction. There was a Baghdadi-based scientist who is a woman who, for many reasons, many misfortunes in her life, radicalized in the late 2000s. And when the Islamic State declared its caliphate, she decided to leave Baghdad and go join Islamic State as a chemical weapons scientist, offering her skills to the terrorist organization. And it was a very interesting and sort of another horrifying story about how someone who on paper educated, great family, lots of different opportunities in her life, how she went down a online internet-based rabbit hole of radicalism, and then naively assumed that, as in Baghdad, where women actually are encouraged to have professional jobs and careers, and as well as be mothers, that she could use this research that she had to build a biological weapon, and the Islamic State would greet her with open arms and add her to their chemical weapons research team. That didn't happen. She was rejected by the Islamic State. She became a lone wolf and came back to Baghdad, intent on setting off her biological weapon there. The Falcons, the spy agency that I'm talking about, caught her, and she's now convicted of terrorism crimes and in prison for life. So, as the ultimate journalistic exercise, trying to get not just the people in my book who are technically heroes, to get them to talk to me wasn't actually quite a stretch. Of course, everyone wants to be labeled a hero in a book of any sort, but getting the villain's family to talk to me took months and months and months. And once I gained their trust and could tell their family's story as well. Abrar is the woman, Abrar al-Kubaisi. Her mother is one of the few people who has access to her in prison, and her mother agreed to send written questions from me into prison for Abrar to answer. So we carried on also a long time conversation like that. So I could then test the interrogator's notes and the interrogator's memories and the family's version of events with the woman who is also whose life I'm also telling in this book. But overall, I think I hope that readers sort of take away from this. There'll be parts of modern Iraqi history, I think, that will be of interest to people who are studying Iraq and Middle East policy and Middle East affairs, as well as counterterrorism affairs. But for someone like me who really loves reading potboilers and Cold War spy thrillers, and also, I grew up watching World War II movies on TV every week with my family. We know the names of our resistance partners from so many other wars. We know the names of those partners. We know their stories. We know their tales of heroism. And this is one way in which I'm trying to put a historic corrective into the narrative of what has happened in Iraq over the last 17 years, and also sort of show Americans at large that there are heroes. There's not just villains there. And we as America, if, we need partners overseas. We can't do everything. Our big tech surveillance state that we've built up as the core of our intelligence services since 9/11 is fantastic for so many different tasks and operations. But the importance of human intelligence and the way in which intelligence professionals really do need to spend time and do the um, old-fashioned source and relationship building is also as important. I mean, this is the trick that Abu Ali al-Basri has, and to show us and to remind us that you can have a drone that shows you where cars are going and who gets out of cars and who enters a building. But until you actually know what is being said inside the room, your intelligence is incomplete. And so being able to understand the culture, being able to understand the core group of the Islamic State leadership, which of course were by and large Iraqis, unlike Al-Qaeda, who were Arabs who went to Afghanistan. The Islamic State, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, that then turned into Islamic State, these are people from the same sort of tribes and cultural background that Abu Ali al-Basri and his men have. And they were able to turn so many of these sort of mid-level guys into their own agents and double agents. And that is one of the real tricks and one of the unsexy things about the ongoing fight against extremism. It's something that the FBI is going to have to do here in the US in terms of being able to understand what white supremacist groups have planned and who they are. And so it's sort of old-fashioned detective work that we used to talk about a lot during the Cold War, and we haven't in a very long time in the era of the war on terror. So yeah, today my book was scheduled to be published last summer, but COVID delays in the publishing world means that it's only coming out now. I remain in touch with all of the men who I'm writing about in the book. It's unfortunate though that that I wasn't able to put an epilogue to my epilogue in the book, because just in late January, for Abu Ali al-Basri, the man who has scored lots of successes as a counterterrorism professional. And Baghdad has been safe, relatively safe for so long. There was a terrible car bombing in Baghdad about 6 weeks ago, about a month ago. And the newish prime minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, before he became prime minister, he was the head of the National Intelligence Agency in Iraq. So my spymaster, Abu Ali al-Basri, and Mustafa al-Kadhimi, the current prime minister, they have had less of a friendly relationship as rivals to two different intelligence agencies in Iraq. Both of them have been vying for the attention of Americans, but also they're vying for the praise that comes with a string of counterterrorism successes that we've seen in Iraq over the last 2 years. So Abu Ali al-Basri, just in the last month, has become a victim of bureaucratic infighting. He was sidelined as the head of the Falcons. Mustafa al-Kadhimi, the prime minister, has decided in a bureaucratic shuffling to put this spy unit underneath the defense ministry in Iraq and the armed forces instead of in the interior ministry, which is where Abu Ali al-Basri has created it and fostered it. And so, again, sort of lessons learned after the 9/11 attacks. One of the 9/11 Commission's top recommendations was there had to be better partnerships and better communication across the US intelligence agencies and security forces. Iraq needs that lesson right now, instead of playing these sort of petty power games. I think that it's a shame, obviously. I have a lot of respect for Abu Ali al-Basri, but politics of personality is what has kept Iraq in so many ways, a dysfunctional state. And I'm not sure where the future goes from here in terms of counterterrorism partnerships. The I mean, the Iraqis need the Americans. I think that that's not going to change. But in terms of having trusted partners, rebuilding those relationships take time, of course. And maybe time isn't something that we have a whole lot of when it comes to imminent threats. So I hope that that's a pretty good overview. I think I will stop there and we can start asking questions.
Great. Let me invite the audience to, we've already got some questions coming in, but please go ahead and submit any questions you have for Margaret using the Q&A function. And in a moment, I'm going to ask Dan Mahaffey to join us and field those questions to you, Margaret. But I wanted to start with a question I have for you based on your experience in Iraq. And just thinking back to some of the lessons from my experience there, which, as I noted at the outset, was 2007, so quite some time ago. But our political debate about the U.S. involvement in Iraq at that time had unfortunately kind of largely degraded into a binary question of should our forces remain and until we win, or accept that we weren't in a winning position at that time and call it the end of the war and come home. And I think history has proven that assessment was too simplistic, and that my argument at the time was when you're in a counterinsurgency environment, clearly, you define victory by your ability to transition authority that the United States seized to a partner. You mentioned the word partner many times. To a partner, and the partner is the people that live in that country. You need to be able to transition to them the authority effectively to handle security. Obviously, for that to work, you need the partner to be ready. But it is, at the end of the day, their responsibility in their country, and you have to move forward on that continuum in order to be successful in a counterinsurgency environment, which is the one we were in. And so I'm interested in your thoughts, because in order for that to work, you have to have a partner that is prepared. My assessment of Iraq at the time was compared to, and I'd spent time in Afghanistan before that. It sounds like you've got a lot of connection with Afghanistan as well. But relative to places like Afghanistan, Iraq had some things going for it in terms of relatively well-educated people, natural resources in the form of oil that gave them money to spend on their own development. Right. And of course, a country that was and continues to be bedeviled by very difficult politics, but they had some advantages and resources to work with. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on how that played out in the intelligence side of things. I don't have as much visibility on the intelligence side as you do. So I'm really interested in your thoughts on, in terms of our transitioning to a capable partner. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you have a very good assessment of Iraq's movement on that continuum of developing their intelligence capabilities. Do you think that, what's your assessment of how the Iraqis had developed those intelligence capabilities overall? It sounds to me like you've assessed them to be quite capable now in terms of handling ISIS. But can you talk a little bit more about where they moved along that sort of last 10 to 15 years continuum of developing their own intelligence capabilities?
Yeah, well, when Saddam Hussein was in power, many Iraqis referred to their homeland as the Republic of Fear. It was a police state writ large, and the overlapping and countless intelligence and police agencies were there to keep the regime in power, not to keep the citizens safe. And so when he is ousted and the government is in free fall, the formula by which you reform a police state is something that Americans really don't know a whole lot about. And that is something that, from my background as someone who studied the Soviet Union and spoke Russian, I was looking at things with sort of a detached part of my brain, thinking, how again can you reform, and is it possible to reform authoritarian governments who used to have police states involved? I think one of the misperceptions that a lot of Americans have is when we're talking about counterinsurgencies. I mean, my book is about the counterterrorism push against Islamic Sunni radicals. But also American forces were fighting a counterinsurgency against Shia militias, right? And when back in 2003, our worldview had, or Washington or the White House's worldview was that there was an axis of evil that included Iran. And so the US forces were actually fighting two separate counterinsurgencies through the mid 2000s. And our Iraqi partners pretty much only wanted to fight one. The Shia majority of Iraq and the Shia majority government wanted to remain focused on a Sunni extremist counterinsurgency. And so that's where we as Americans came into a lot of pushback in terms of what the US goals were versus what our partner Iraq's national security goals were. So, that's where, in terms of mistakes and who the Americans anointed to take on certain roles, and specifically in the intelligence agency, that's where trouble started. And I talk about a bit of this in my book. As the CIA and via the Pentagon, which and the budget for reconstruction in Iraq, US taxpayers were paying $1 billion a year for at least 3 years in a row to stand up the National Intelligence Service of Iraq. And that was the main agency to fight our counterinsurgency battles. And from the US point of view, the administration at the time wanted that National Intelligence Agency to focus squarely on Iran. And Sunni extremism was coming second because of the personalities that the US anointed to head up that new brave organization. So when there was just too many Al-Qaeda based bombings and the bloodshed was so great, the natural policy focus had to shift to fighting Al-Qaeda instead of Iranian-based militias. And that's when partnerships, like sustainable partnerships, were born, I think, between Iraqi agencies and the U.S. In part because, like any international partnership, national security priorities have to overlap in order for operations to work. But in the last 20 years in Iraq, in terms of a generation, it's difficult for any institution to change, right? There's an institutional persona that exists in any bureaucracy. Looking back over the arc of change that has happened in Moscow since the late 1990s. The KGB was the KGB is the KGB, and so I think it's probably a quite an enormously good news kind of story to understand that something like the Falcons has been able to exist in Iraq despite all of these other all these terrible events and all of the inertia that keeps the bureaucracies in Iraq from moving forward in professional and modern ways. So the intelligence battles have just been really, really hard to document, in part because people who work in the intelligence world, people who are spies, live in the shadows. You don't seek out attention because you can't do your job that way. And so it was a real huge hole, I think, in what we all understood about how Iraq works and doesn't work. But of course, one thing that we can all see about Iraq is that there's still not a monopoly on the use of violence and the use of power in Iraq. There's so many disparate forces who maybe on paper look like they're under a unified control, but actually individually act without a whole lot of control around them. That's in terms of trying to build up a professional and effective intelligence agency. That's got to be the next step, that there is a chain of command that's followed and a set of priorities that's followed. And so whether or not the US can play a positive role in that right now, I'm not sure. I mean, there's still Iraqi political factions who really do desire US presence. And given the battles we all fought together to defeat the Islamic State, Iraqis know pretty much that you need America on your side in order to keep your borders free from foreign extremists. But again, the priorities have to align. The last administration in the White House wasn't ready to really engage in a with international partnerships. And so again, we've had 4 years lost in trying to build that capacity in Iraq.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your perspective on that. Let me invite Dan Mahaffey. We've got several audience questions, so I'm going to invite Dan to come and field those to you. Dan?
Thanks, Glenn, and thanks, Margaret. We've got some great questions here. I think one of the first I'll ask comes up is how in your reporting did you find they spoke of former Ba'athist army officials? How did that help ISIS get its momentum early on? That support from Ba'athists as well as the old Al Qaeda in Iraq.
Yeah, well, there's a lot by the mid late 2000s. There were a lot of different groups in Iraq who had grievances, and some of those grievances were focused on the U.S. Some of them were focused on the Shia-dominated government, and they found common cause together with the extremist ideologues that we know now as well, the rump of what was then the Islamic State that turned into the Islamic State. It's been a really interesting to watch from the sidelines. Again, I'm not an academic. I'm a journalist. I'm out in the field and I'm talking to people in real time and using my little gray cells to put together lots of pieces of evidence that I'm picking up. Although we've seen the horrible videos, we've seen the beheadings, we've seen the bloodshed, and we've seen the rabid ideology that Islamic State tried to enforce over the population it controlled. We also see that from a strategic point of view, the Islamic State leadership was very willing to partner up with people who weren't as rabidly ideological as they were, in order to leverage all of the talents that these different Iraqi groups with their grievances had. So former Ba'athists who were trained in KGB methods as secret police officers, they had a lot to offer a rump state that didn't have an intelligence service or the tools or the bureaucratic know-how to build up case files and surveillance techniques. And so together they became an incredibly formidable force, either despite of or because of ideology.
In working with Abu Ali and some of the other Iraqis, obviously a history, you mentioned the Republic of Fear, Saddam's Iraq before then Iraq under American occupation, then a battlefield between ISIS, Iraq, Iraqis, Iran. What did they speak of building of their own Iraqi identity or a future idea of Iraqi nationalism that is, partners with the United States, partners with Iran, but not defined by neighbors, occupiers, and dictators?
Yeah, I think it's easy for lots of Americans to forget this sort of intrinsic Iraqi pride, right? I mean, it is the cradle of civilization, and I know that the Persians have a claim to stake in that fight as well. But Iraqis believe it. They're a place where they're a place that have their own cuisine, their own Arabic accents, their own football teams. And all of these aspects of how you can fly your national flag without resorting to sectarian bloodshed. I mean, Iraqis care deeply about trying to find that balance. And one thing that was pretty extraordinary through all of the grim, devastating, bloody statistics of the battle against Islamic State was that really, as a nation, no matter the ethnic group or the sectarian background, Iraqis formed formed, civil defense organizations that then went out into the battlefield and defended Iraq. There really wasn't a large national debate about where the borders of Iraq were. Everybody knew that you wanted to push back to the borders that were drawn out very unceremoniously by colonialists more than 100 years ago. But the fact is that Iraqis know who Iraqis are, and they are not Syrians. There are tribal ties across the border with Syria and Iran, and between Kurdish tribes as well. But Iraqis are Iraqis. And so unwittingly, I think, my original story that I wrote about Captain Harith Sudani and the Falcons and the undercover operation that they had successfully made, I unwittingly created the first national hero of a generation for Iraq. And when my story was first published in the paper, I was getting phone calls and DMs online from Iraqis of all stripes saying, "This is an amazing story. We are so proud. We didn't know we had it in us. We didn't know we had it in us to do something this great." And so these were messages coming from Erbil and Suleimania, as well as the Iraqi Shia South. And so I think that when you build a national identity, you need to have heroes. And having ordinary men do extraordinary things at a time of an existential threat is a pretty safe way to start building that kind of heroism that helps everyone understand who they are as a nation and where they can be and who they want to be, really. Taking out the religious iconography of that, taking out the automatic weapons that everybody in Iraq seems to have. It's a slow process, but hopefully stories like this will help.
And separate from, as you mentioned, the academic analyses of Iranian influence or gauging various parties and ministries, what did you see, though, in your time, at least as in looking at your book, and how intelligence officials looked at certain events? If you see an Iranian behind every corner, or every attack is ISIS, you can become too focused. How did they balance all the various groups wanting to attack them when there are your own perceptions of who the enemy is already?
Yeah, look, there were lots of I went through lots and lots of files of Iraqi National Security Council meetings. So, the behind the scenes look of what those discussions actually looked like with the Iraqis, the Iraqi players at the table, and Americans, British, and other international partners, on the sidelines. But yeah, there's no getting around the fact that there were some really irrational sectarian discussions that were happening through the mid 2000s, and the way that national security threats were magnified and then not prosecuted because of sectarian influences and ideologies. But in my book, I sort of document how the real turning point in terms of intelligence gathering and what people, I think, just writ large. In 2006 and 2007, the bloodshed was so bad that at some level, policymakers just had to put aside the sectarian differences. The huge bombing in Samarra, which is the religious shrine city just north of Baghdad. The national intelligence chief at the time was a Sunni who had been a very long-term CIA partner before Saddam's ouster, and was then awarded with this new job. He was looking for Iranian spies everywhere, and he came to a National Security Council meeting with a report that said that that the Samarra shrine bombing was actually a false flag operation perpetrated by the Iranians and not Al Qaeda. That just rang so untrue and so preposterous that he finally lost credibility with the Americans even. And that was, a pathway through which Abu Ali al-Basri could move into that partnership role, because evidence doesn't lie. And at the end of the day, just like detectives in a police force, intelligence agencies have to find their men, right? We know that there's criminals. We call them terrorists in this case. And unless you actually find the right people responsible for all this bloodshed, you're going to lose credibility. So Abu Ali al-Basri is a man who has, the temperament, which is, I think, rare among Iraqis. I say this with a lot of love in my heart. Some of my best friends are actually Iraqi. Among Arabs, Iraqis are known as a group that they call a group with hot blood, right? They fly off the handle with ease, and then they come back down very easily as well. But Abu Ali al-Basri is a man who is incredibly contemplative as a personality. He's basically he's very melancholic. He doesn't draw attention to himself. He is the Arab equivalent of George Smiley. And so, from a very calm, collected, soft-spoken point of view, when he enters a room and shows you the files, and you can see exactly who's responsible and why, and see the groundwork and the police work that they've done to build up this case against terror suspects, you can trust it, no matter what, again, how you pray or what part of the country you come from.
Moving on to some more, a few questions here that are more about current events, and moving on from your book, but still in the same vein. How were the Iraqi intelligence processes, our cooperation with them, affected by the killing of Soleimani on Iraqi soil?
That's a hard question to answer. I'm not sure that there is an answer right now. I think that there's so many Iraqis that suit up every day in defense of their nation, who again aren't getting on the Arabic language TV channels, aren't haranguing at the top of the hour every hour about who the great Satan is and why Iraq doesn't need any outsiders helping it out. And so if you pull away from that noise, it's very important to follow the noise, but if you pull away from that, the partnerships endure. The Americans have learned that as a Western military, you can't have a huge footprint in Iraq and be effective. It's counterproductive because the Americans actually don't know Iraq well enough to take it over, and the Iraqis don't want them to go blustering through their towns and their cities and their homes. So there's been an equilibrium that's been established with the Islamic State battles. There were war rooms in the heart of the Green Zone that had the US-backed coalition forces and intelligence services in the room with their Iraqi principals and counterparts. And then about 200 yards away, there was a parallel war room that had Russian and Iranian and Syrian generals and intelligence officers with their Iraqi counterparts. And so those parallel partnerships were to the good of Iraq. And I do also believe that they were to the good of the Americans, because again, more information brought to the table, even if they're separate tables that then can be walked back and forth. It helps everybody, because again, the mission was the same, the defeat of the Islamic State. And so all of the rest of the problems and contradictions of our national security goals can fall by the wayside in pursuit of the one mission.
What do you think the recent removal of Abu Ali means for Iraqi intelligence and politics?
Well, there's definitely an ongoing power struggle right now in terms of elected officials, as always, trying to sing for their supper and keep their seats ahead of new elections. Of course, from a very academic point of view, institutions need to professionalize, and there needs to be standards in terms of what different agencies and what different units do within intelligence services or military forces. That you can't really argue about. But I think in this particular situation, this really is about politics of personality and some bad blood coming back to to the detriment of Abu Ali al-Basri. The Iraqis need a foreign intelligence service. They also need a domestic intelligence service. And where counterterrorism fits within that continuum is a very fluid concept. When Islamic State are led by Iraqis, that threat is internal. And I don't know whether, from a professional analysis, whether Iraqi bureaucrats and Iraqi elected officials have decided that counterterrorism is now a foreign-based threat, and that's why the Falcons are being moved into the realm of the defense ministry. But the Interior Ministry has a huge intelligence budget, and they have a huge intelligence challenges ahead. We all know that there are multitudes of militias that need to be looked at and maybe fought, not in the not so distant future. And so whether or not Abu Ali has a chance to use his skills again as an effective player in any of these battles, I think we'll have to wait until the next elections to see whether he's able to have a chance of redemption.
And thus far, this story, it's an upcoming story, but it's been, I wouldn't even say below the fold. It's been A22 in US newspapers. Pope Francis is heading to Iraq. What do you think of that as a test for Iraqi security services, as well as the imagery of that for Iraqis, what that means?
Yeah, well, full disclosure, I'm a Roman Catholic, so I find it to be amazing and brilliant that Pope Francis wants to go visit Iraq, which, of course, as all of us on this event probably know, is one of the deepest, largest Christian communities in the Arab world. And from a security point of view, I think it's. I mean, obviously, there's always a threat when you go to Iraq, but I really truly believe in the capabilities of the Iraqi security forces. I don't believe that Pope Francis is going to find any terrorist threats to him. I mean, COVID is a whole nother issue, right? I mean, if all of us who troll Iraqi social media know that there's not many government officials who keep the protocols and put their masks on, and the signs of hospitality and greeting in Iraq include lots of cheek kissing and handshaking and hugging. So, hopefully Pope Francis is not going to be exposed to COVID while he's there as a security issue. But it's overdue and quite extraordinary, I think, that the head of the Roman Catholic Church is going to meet the most influential leader of the Shia faith, and putting Ali Sistani and Pope Francis together into a room, I think will have enormous amounts of benefits in terms of the way in which religion flavors Middle East politics vis-a-vis Iran for years to come.
And what do you think that is the action of meeting with Sistani as a Shiite leader over Iranian officials? What message does that send?
Well, I think that there's a lot of theological underpinning for that. In terms of the quietist school versus the non-quietist school of Shia faith. Ali Sistani, Shias don't just exist in Iraq and Iran; they exist throughout the world. And I don't know that there's even any controversy that Ali Sistani is not the preeminent Ayatollah in terms of Shias around the world and the figure that they choose to emulate. So from a pure theological point of view, I think that it's a straightforward meeting of the minds, and in terms of how religion is so important in people's lives and how religion can flavor and influence morality when it comes to everyday lives. I'm not sure what the Iranians will take away from this. That's always a $1 million question about any international event. So I would hesitate to answer that side of that question.
Well, I thank you for answering the questions as we went from counterterrorism to Catholic theology. We ran the gamut there, but appreciate your responses. Thank you to the audience for these great questions. Before I turn it back over to Glenn, any closing comments or thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Well, we are in discussions to sell the film rights of the book, and it will maybe bring a chuckle to everyone on this call to know that all the Iraqi main characters in the book would really like to have Rami Malek play them in any film version of the book. So if anyone does have any inside wasta with Rami Malek, please get in touch so we can get him involved in this project.
We'll activate the phone tree in the network to see who can get a hold of him.
Great.
Thank you, Margaret. It's great to hear that you're in discussions for turning the book into a film. You know, obviously, it is in the interest of CSPC to spread the word about good works like yours, because we think the lessons are valuable for our understanding of American national security. And as you suggested, the importance of these partnerships, where we can help develop them and where they can help us in terms of our ability to understand the world. Turning a book into a film will give you better ability to reach more people. So obviously we would love to see that happen, and really appreciate you, first of all, spending the time in Baghdad that it took to really develop the understanding of the situational awareness and the context that led you to decide that creating such a book would be valuable and worthwhile, and then doing the work on the book. I was really fascinated with your process. You put a significant amount of effort into ensuring that you had focused on several, it sounds like several kind of compelling characters in a very personal and well-informed way. So thank you for doing that. It sounds like an amazing read, and I hope everybody will, on this call, will take the opportunity to read The Spymaster of Baghdad, a true story of bravery, family, and patriotism in the battle against ISIS. And Margaret Coker, thank you for joining us today. We really appreciated having you. Look forward to seeing you again. And to all our participants, thank you as well. And I want to wish everyone well and be safe. And we'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Margaret. Bye-bye.